The bell above the door chimed with a harsh metallic clang as Marcus Thompson stepped into Sullivan's pawn and gold exchange, clutching a small velvet box against his chest like it contained his last breath. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting an unforgiving glare across rows of dusty guitars, expired electronics, and forgotten dreams marked with price tags. Behind the bulletproof glass partition, Dave Sullivan looked up from his newspaper with the expression of a man who had seen every sob story twice and believed none of them. Marcus hesitated at the threshold, his weathered hands trembling slightly as he approached the counter. The Purple Heart in the box felt heavier than the day it was pinned to his chest in that sterile military hospital, heavier than the shrapnel that had earned it, heavier than the weight of what he was about to do. His daughter Sarah's medical bills crumpled in his back pocket seemed to whisper accusations with every step he took across the linoleum floor. Sullivan barely glanced up as Marcus placed the velvet box on the scarred wooden counter. The pawn shop owner's fingers were stained with coffee and ink, his gut straining against a faded Phoenix Suns t-shirt that had seen better decades. Kyle Henderson, a lanky kid with arms covered in tattoos depicting skulls and eagles, looked over from where he was pricing a collection of old DVDs. The afternoon sun slanted through dirty windows, highlighting the dust motes that danced between shelves packed with the remnants of other people's desperation. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Marcus cleared his throat, the sound echoing in the cramped space like a gunshot in the desert. Sullivan finally looked up, his pale blue eyes scanning Marcus from head to toe with practiced indifference. The veteran stood there in work boots that had seen too many double shifts, jeans with permanent grease stains from his security job, and a flannel shirt that hung loose on his frame. To Sullivan, he looked like every other desperate customer who walked through those doors, another hard-luck case with something to sell and a story to match. "What you got there, buddy?" Sullivan asked, his voice carrying the boredom of a man who had heard every pitch, every plea, every promise. He didn't bother putting down his newspaper, just gestured vaguely at the box with his pen. Marcus opened the velvet case with reverence, revealing the Purple Heart nestled against faded purple silk. The bronze heart-shaped metal caught the harsh light, its profile of George Washington seeming to stare accusingly at the transaction about to unfold. The ribbon, though carefully preserved, showed the subtle wear of age and the careful handling of someone who treasured what it represented. Kyle wandered over, drawn by curiosity and the slow pace of a Thursday afternoon. He leaned against the counter, his sleeve tattoos rippling as he crossed his arms. "Purple Heart, huh?" he said with a smirk that suggested he'd seen his share of military memorabilia come through those doors. "Let me guess. Grandpa left it to you in his will?" Marcus felt his jaw tighten, but he kept his voice steady. "It's mine. I need to sell it." The words tasted like ash in his mouth, each syllable a betrayal of everything he'd once believed about honor and sacrifice. But Sarah's surgery couldn't wait for his pride, and the bills wouldn't pay themselves with noble intentions. Sullivan finally set down his paper and leaned forward, squinting at the metal through the glass partition. "Yours, huh?" His tone carried the skepticism of a man who'd been lied to by experts. "You got paperwork? Certificate? These things come with documentation, you know." "I have the citation," Marcus replied, reaching into his jacket pocket. His fingers found the folded paper he'd kept all these years, the official description of the day that changed everything. But as he pulled it out, Sullivan waved him off with an impatient gesture. "Hold up there, Chief. Let me take a look at this thing first." Sullivan stood up, his considerable bulk shifting as he moved around the counter. He picked up the Purple Heart case, holding it at arm's length, like it might contaminate him. "Kyle, grab that magnifying glass from the back." As Kyle shuffled off to retrieve the magnifying glass, another customer entered the shop. Rick Martinez, a stocky man in his 40s wearing a Harley-Davidson t-shirt and a skeptical expression, approached the counter with a handful of old tools. He glanced at the Purple Heart in Sullivan's hands and let out a low whistle. Purple Heart, eh? Martinez said, setting his tools down with a metallic clatter. My brother-in-law tried to pawn one of those last year. Turned out to be a fake he bought on eBay for $50. He laughed, a harsh sound that made Marcus's shoulders tense. These guys think we're all idiots. Sullivan nodded knowingly as Kyle returned with the magnifying glass. That's the thing about military stuff. Half the people who come in here with medals never served a day in their lives. They think we can't tell the difference. He held the Purple Heart up to the light, examining it through the magnifying glass with exaggerated thoroughness. Marcus stood perfectly still, watching his most precious possession being handled like a piece of questionable merchandise. The irony wasn't lost on him that he was standing in a pawn shop, surrounded by the detritus of broken dreams, trying to sell the very symbol of his service to his country. The medal represented the worst day of his military career, and somehow, simultaneously, his finest moment. The weight feels off, Sullivan announced, passing the medal to Kyle. And look at this engraving. See how the letters aren't quite right? The spacing's all wrong. He spoke with the confidence of someone who'd watched too many episodes of shows about antique appraisals and thought himself an expert. Kyle held the medal up to his face, squinting dramatically. Yeah, I see what you mean. And the ribbon looks too new. Like someone just bought it online and aged it with coffee or something. He handed it back to Sullivan with a theatrical shake of his head. Definitely a replica. Martinez leaned in closer, enjoying the developing drama. I told you, man. These fake veterans are everywhere now. They buy this stuff online and try to pass it off as the real deal. Probably never even been in the military. He looked Marcus up and down with undisguised contempt. What branch you claim to serve in anyway? Army, Marcus replied quietly, his voice barely audible above the humming fluorescent lights. 3rd Infantry Division, 2nd Battalion. Served 3 tours in Afghanistan. Each word felt like pulling teeth, not because it wasn't true, but because he could see in their faces that they'd already made up their minds. Sullivan barked out a laugh that had no humor in it. 3rd Infantry, huh? That's convenient. That's what they all say. You probably Googled famous Army units before walking in here. He tossed the medal case back onto the counter with deliberate carelessness, making Marcus flinch as the precious metal rattled inside. Listen, pal, I've been in this business for 20 years. You think I can't spot a fake Purple Heart from a mile away? It's not fake, Marcus said, his voice growing stronger despite the humiliation burning in his chest. I was wounded by an IED outside Kandahar in 2011. Lost 3 good men that day, and I spent 4 months in rehabilitation learning to walk again. The memories came flooding back unbidden, the smell of burning fuel, the ringing in his ears, the weight of Tommy Jackson's body in his arms. Kyle rolled his eyes and exchanged a knowing look with Sullivan. Oh, here we go. Now we get the whole war story. They always have a war story. He picked up his pricing gun and pretended to be busy, but Marcus could see he was listening to every word, probably filing away details to mock later. You want to know what happened? Marcus continued, his voice taking on an edge that made Martinez take a step back. We were escorting a convoy of medical supplies to a forward operating base. Our Humvee hit a buried IED, and the explosion flipped us over. I woke up upside down with shrapnel in my leg and back, bleeding all over Tommy Jackson, my gunner. He was 19 years old, from some small town in Ohio, and he died calling for his mother. The shop had grown quiet, except for the persistent buzzing of the lights and the distant hum of traffic outside. Even Sullivan seemed momentarily affected by the raw emotion in Marcus's voice, but he quickly recovered his skeptical demeanor. That's a real touching story, Sullivan said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. But anybody can look up battle reports online and memorize the details. Hell, you probably watched it in some movie. You got any proof you were actually there? Dog tags, military ID? Anything besides this fake medal and a rehearsed sob story. Marcus reached for his wallet, his hands shaking with barely controlled anger. I have my VA card. My driver's license shows my veteran status. But even as he pulled out the cards, he could see the doubt in their faces hadn't wavered. Martinez laughed again, a sound like breaking glass. V.A. card? You can fake those too. My cousin knows a guy who makes them on his computer. Sells them to people who want the veteran discounts at Home Depot. He turned to address Kyle and Sullivan as if Marcus wasn't standing right there. These stolen valor guys are getting more sophisticated every year. Stolen valor, Kyle repeated, nodding sagely like he'd just learned a new phrase. That's what they call it when people pretend to be veterans, right? It's like super illegal or something. He looked at Marcus with newfound suspicion. Dude, you could go to jail for this. Sullivan leaned back against the counter, crossing his arms over his substantial belly. Here's the thing, friend. Even if this metal was real, which I seriously doubt, I couldn't give you more than $50 for it. The market's flooded with military memorabilia. Purple Hearts aren't exactly rare these days. His tone suggested he was doing Marcus a favor by even considering the purchase. $50. Marcus felt the words hit him like a physical blow. The metal represented months of pain, years of nightmares, a lifetime of carrying the weight of survival when better men had died. That metal is worth more than everything in this store combined, not because of its monetary value, but because of what it represents. What it represents, Sullivan mocked, is about $50 in scrap metal and a nice story. But since I'm pretty sure it's fake anyway, I'm thinking more like 20. Take it or leave it. He turned back to his newspaper, as if the conversation was over, dismissing Marcus with the casual cruelty of someone who'd never risked anything more valuable than his lunch money. The bell above the door chimed again as another customer entered. Lisa Chen, a middle-aged woman in nursing scrubs, looked around the shop with the harried expression of someone on a break between shifts. She approached the jewelry case, glancing curiously at the tense scene unfolding at the main counter. Marcus stared at the purple heart lying in its case, the afternoon light making the bronze surface gleam like it was on fire. In that moment, he could see Tommy Jackson's face as clearly as if his fallen friend was standing in the shop. Tommy had always said that Marcus was the bravest soldier in their unit, the one who never left a man behind, the one who always found a way to bring everyone home. What would Tommy think of him now, standing in a pawn shop, letting strangers mock his service and belittle his sacrifice? You know what? Marcus said, his voice quiet but carrying a dangerous undertone that made Kyle stop pretending to work. That medal represents the day I carried 2 wounded soldiers through a minefield, while my own leg was shredded by shrapnel. It represents the night I held my best friend while he died, because the medevac couldn't get to us through the rocket fire. It represents 3 tours in hell, and coming home to a country that doesn't give a damn about the people who fought for it. Sullivan looked up from his paper, irritation flickering across his face. Look, buddy, I don't know what kind of response you're expecting here, but the pity party isn't going to make this fake metal any more valuable. You want to sell it or not? Because I got other customers to deal with. Martinez stepped closer to Marcus, his voice taking on a threatening tone. Maybe you should just take your fake metal and get out of here before this gets embarrassing. Nobody's buying your story, soldier boy. He emphasized the last words with mockery that hit Marcus like a slap. The shop felt smaller somehow, the walls closing in, as Marcus realized he was surrounded by people who saw him as nothing more than a desperate fraud. The fluorescent lights seemed to buzz louder, the air felt thicker, and for a moment he was back in that overturned Humvee. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Trapped and bleeding, waiting for help that took too long to arrive. But this time, he wasn't trapped. This time, he could fight back. Marcus straightened his shoulders, drawing himself up to his full height. Years of military training and discipline had taught him how to project authority, even when everything was falling apart around him. I earned this medal, he said, his voice cutting through the ambient noise of the shop like a blade. I earned it with blood and pain and watching good men die. And I'll be damned if I'm going to stand here and let you call me a liar. Sullivan stood up again, his bulk making the floor creak. And I'll be damned if I'm going to let some con artist waltz into my shop and try to pass off a fake medal as the real deal. You want to prove it's real? Fine. Let's call someone who would know. He reached for the phone on the counter, his fingers hovering over the numbers. What's the number for the Pentagon? They keep records of this stuff, right? The question hung in the air like smoke from a battlefield, and for the first time since entering the shop, Marcus smiled. It wasn't a pleasant smile, but rather the expression of a man who'd just been handed exactly what he needed to prove his point. Go ahead, Marcus said, his voice steady and confident for the first time all afternoon. Call them. Sullivan's face went pale as he stared at the phone, his bravado suddenly evaporating like morning mist. The confident smirk that had dominated his features moments before was replaced by something that looked suspiciously like panic. His thick fingers hovered over the rotary dial, as if it had suddenly become radioactive, and beads of sweat began forming on his forehead despite the shop's aggressive air conditioning. Kyle stopped his pretense of organizing DVDs and turned to watch his boss with growing confusion. The young man had never seen Sullivan back down from anything, let alone from what they both assumed was just another desperate customer with a fabricated story. Martinez shifted uncomfortably, his earlier enthusiasm for the confrontation beginning to wane as he sensed the changing atmosphere in the cramped shop. Well? Marcus asked, his voice carrying a new authority that seemed to fill the space between the cluttered shelves. Are you going to make that call, or are you just going to stand there sweating through your shirt? His eyes never left Sullivan's face, reading every micro-expression, every tell that revealed the pawn shop owner's growing uncertainty. Sullivan's hand trembled slightly as he reached for the phone, then pulled back as if he'd been burned. Look, maybe we're being a little hasty here, he stammered, his voice losing the condescending tone that had characterized their entire interaction. The Pentagon's a busy place. They probably don't have time to deal with pawn shop inquiries. Lisa Chen looked up from the jewelry case where she'd been pretending to browse, her nurse's instincts picking up on the tension that had transformed the mundane afternoon transaction into something much more significant. She moved closer to the counter, her professional experience with crisis situations telling her that something important was about to unfold. Marcus pulled out his wallet again, this time with deliberate slowness, and extracted a worn business card. Here, he said, placing it on the counter next to the Purple Heart case. That's the direct number for the Department of Defense Personnel Recovery Office. They handle inquiries about military awards and decorations. Ask for Colonel Patricia Hayes. She's the one who signed my medical discharge papers. The business card lay on the scarred wooden surface like a gauntlet thrown down in medieval combat. Sullivan stared at it as if it might explode, his earlier confidence completely shattered. Kyle crept closer, squinting at the official-looking card with its Department of Defense seal and precise typography. How do we know this isn't fake, too? Kyle asked, but his voice lacked conviction. The card looked official in a way that was difficult to replicate, with raised lettering and security features that would have cost more to fake than any pawnshop transaction was worth. Martinez laughed, but it was a nervous sound now, lacking the cruel edge it had carried before. Come on, man. You're not seriously going to call the Pentagon over some guy's war story. They've got better things to do than verify every piece of military junk that comes through here. Marcus reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, the official citation that had accompanied his Purple Heart. He unfolded it carefully, the creases worn soft from years of handling, and placed it next to the business card. The document bore multiple official seals, signatures, and the kind of formal language that government bureaucrats used when documenting acts of heroism. 3rd Infantry Division, 2nd Battalion, Alpha Company, Marcus read aloud, his voice taking on the cadence of someone reciting something memorized through repetition and pain. Specialist Marcus Thompson distinguished himself by exceptionally valorous conduct in the face of enemy action on November 15, 2011, near Kandahar Province, Afghanistan. When his convoy came under attack from an improvised explosive device, Specialist Thompson, despite suffering severe injuries to his left leg and back, refused medical evacuation until he had successfully evacuated 2 wounded comrades from the kill zone. The shop had fallen completely silent, except for the persistent buzzing of the fluorescent lights and the distant sound of traffic outside. Even the air conditioning seemed to have quieted, as if the building itself was holding its breath. Sullivan's newspaper lay forgotten on the counter, and Kyle had stopped all pretense of working. Marcus continued reading, his voice growing stronger with each word. Specialist Thompson's actions directly resulted in saving the lives of Private First Class David Rodriguez and Sergeant Michael Chen, both of whom suffered critical injuries but survived due to his intervention. During the evacuation, Specialist Thompson was wounded a second time by enemy small arms fire, but continued to provide covering fire for the medical helicopter until all personnel were safely extracted. Lisa Chen gasped softly, her hand moving unconsciously to her chest. As a nurse, she understood the kind of split-second decisions and selfless courage that Marcus was describing. She looked at him with new eyes, seeing past the worn clothes and tired appearance to the man who had risked everything for his fellow soldiers. "The citation goes on," Marcus said, folding the paper carefully and returning it to his pocket. "But I think you get the idea. Now, are you going to make that call? Or are you going to keep insulting a man who earned this medal with his blood?" Sullivan's face had progressed from pale to an alarming shade of gray. He picked up the phone with shaking hands, then set it down again immediately. "Look, Mr. Thompson, maybe I was a little quick to judge. You know how it is in this business. We see a lot of fake stuff come through here, and sometimes we get a little suspicious." "A little suspicious?" Marcus's voice carried a dangerous edge that made Kyle take a step backward. "You called me a fraud, a con artist, and suggested I was committing a federal crime. You mocked my service and disrespected the memory of good men who died fighting for this country. That's not being a little suspicious, that's being an ignorant fool." Martinez had backed away from the counter entirely, suddenly finding the collection of power tools near the far wall intensely interesting. His earlier bravado had evaporated completely, replaced by the uncomfortable realization that he'd been part of humiliating a genuine war hero. "Maybe we should just forget the whole thing," Sullivan suggested, his voice taking on a pleading quality that was almost comical, coming from a man of his size and usual authority. "You don't really want to sell that medal anyway, right? It's got sentimental value, family heirloom and all that." Marcus shook his head slowly, his expression a mixture of disappointment and disgust. "No, you don't get to back out now. You wanted proof, and you're going to get it. Make the call." He pointed at the business card with a finger that brooked no argument. "Ask for Colonel Hayes. Tell her you have a Purple Heart recipient here who needs verification. Give her my name and service number." The bell above the door chimed again as another customer entered the shop. This time, it was an elderly man in a veteran's baseball cap, walking with the aid of a cane. He took one look at the tense scene at the counter and paused, his experienced eyes taking in the Purple Heart case, the official documents, and the obvious distress on Sullivan's face. "Everything all right here?" the elderly veteran asked, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd seen his share of conflicts, both military and civilian. His cap identified him as a Vietnam veteran, and the ribbons pinned to it suggested he'd seen more than his share of combat. "Fine, everything's fine," Sullivan said quickly, but his voice cracked slightly on the words. "Just a routine transaction." The elderly man's eyes found the Purple Heart case, and his expression immediately softened. "Purple Heart?" he asked Marcus, who nodded grimly. "What unit?" "3rd Infantry Division, 2nd Battalion," Marcus replied, his posture straightening automatically in the presence of a fellow veteran. "Afghanistan, 2011. The elderly man extended his hand with the kind of respect that transcended age and rank. "Walter Kowalski, 1st Cavalry Division, Vietnam, 1968. "It's an honor, son." His handshake was firm despite his advanced age, and his eyes held the kind of understanding that only came from shared experience. Sullivan watched this exchange with growing alarm, realizing that his situation was deteriorating rapidly. The presence of another veteran in the shop had shifted the dynamic even further in Marcus's favor. and the pawnshop owner was beginning to understand that he'd made a serious error in judgment. "Mr. Kowalski," Marcus said, returning the handshake with equal respect. "These gentlemen seem to think my Purple Heart is fake. They've been kind enough to suggest that I'm committing stolen valor, and that my citation is fabricated. I was just about to have them call the Pentagon to verify my service record." Kowalski's expression darkened as he turned to look at Sullivan and Kyle. "You boys think this man's Purple Heart is fake?" His voice carried decades of authority, and despite his age, there was something in his bearing that suggested crossing him would be unwise. Kyle squirmed under the elderly veteran's gaze. "Well, we see a lot of replica medals come through here. It's hard to tell the real ones from the fakes sometimes." "Hard to tell?" Kowalski's voice rose slightly, causing other customers in the shop to look over with curiosity. "Son, I've been looking at Purple Hearts for 50 years, and I can tell you right now that this is the real deal. The weight, the finish, the ribbon wear, everything about it screams authentic." He picked up the metal case and examined it with the practiced eye of someone who knew what he was looking at. Lisa Chen stepped closer to the counter, her curiosity overcoming her natural inclination to avoid confrontation. "Excuse me," she said to Marcus, "but did you say you saved 2 soldiers during that attack?" Her voice carried the professional interest of someone in the medical field who understood the life and death implications of battlefield medicine. Marcus nodded, suddenly looking older and more tired than his years. "David Rodriguez and Michael Chen. Rodriguez had shrapnel in his abdomen and was bleeding out. Chen had a compound fracture of his left femur and couldn't walk. The Humvee was upside down, and we were taking fire from at least 3 directions." "How did you get them out?" Lisa asked, her professional fascination overriding the awkwardness of the situation. "Fireman's carry for Rodriguez. Had to drag Chen by his equipment straps," Marcus replied, his voice taking on the clinical tone of someone recounting a medical procedure. "The blast had damaged my left leg, but I could still move. They couldn't. It was that simple." He paused, lost in the memory for a moment. "Took 3 trips to get them both to the landing zone. By the time the medevac arrived, I'd lost enough blood that they had to carry me onto the bird, too." Kowalski nodded approvingly. "That's what we do, son. We bring our people home." He turned to Sullivan with undisguised contempt. "And this is how you treat a man who risked his life for his brothers? Calling him a liar and a fraud?" Sullivan's face had now progressed to an alarming shade of green. "Look, Mr. Kowalski, we didn't know. In this business, you have to be careful. People try to pass off fake military stuff all the time." "Then you should have asked better questions instead of making assumptions," Kowalski replied sharply. "This man has the bearing of a soldier. His citation is obviously authentic, and his medal shows the kind of wear that only comes from years of respectful handling. Anyone with half a brain could see that." Marcus looked around the shop at the assembled faces, seeing something he hadn't expected to find in a pawn shop in downtown Phoenix. Lisa Chen was looking at him with the kind of professional respect that medical personnel reserved for those who'd performed under extreme pressure. Kowalski was radiating the brotherhood that existed between veterans regardless of when or where they'd served. Even Kyle seemed to be reconsidering his earlier assumptions, though he was clearly too embarrassed to admit his mistake outright. Only Sullivan remained defiant, though his defiance was beginning to look more like desperation. "Fine," he said, grabbing the phone with both hands as if it were a lifeline. "Let's call this Colonel Hayes and get this settled once and for all. But when it turns out I was right, I want an apology from all of you." Marcus smiled grimly, the expression of a man who was about to be vindicated in the most public way possible. "Go ahead and dial," he said. "But I think you're the one who's going to be apologizing." Sullivan's hands shook as he began to dial the number on the business card, each digit seeming to require tremendous effort. The shop had fallen completely silent except for the mechanical clicking of the rotary phone, a sound that seemed to echo off the walls like gunfire. Kyle watched his boss with growing concern, finally beginning to understand that their usual routine of intimidating customers into accepting lowball offers wasn't going to work this time. "Pentagon switchboard," came a crisp voice from the phone's speaker, loud enough for everyone in the shop to hear. Sullivan nearly dropped the handset in surprise, not expecting to actually reach the Pentagon on his first try. Yes," Sullivan stammered. "I need to speak to Colonel Patricia Hayes in the Personnel Recovery Office." His voice cracked slightly on the words, and beads of sweat were now visible on his forehead. "One moment, please," the operator replied with professional efficiency. The hold music that followed was tinny and patriotic, filling the shop with a martial tune that seemed to mock Sullivan's obvious discomfort. Marcus stood perfectly still, his arms crossed over his chest, watching Sullivan's face with the satisfaction of a man who knew exactly how this conversation was going to end. Kowalski remained beside him, his presence lending additional weight to the moment, while Lisa Chen watched with the fascination of someone witnessing a dramatic reversal of fortune. The hold music stopped abruptly, replaced by a woman's voice that carried unmistakable military authority. "This is Colonel Hayes, Personnel Recovery. How can I help you?" Sullivan's mouth opened and closed several times before any sound emerged. "Colonel Hayes, this is Dave Sullivan from Sullivan's Pawn Shop in Phoenix, Arizona. I have a customer here claiming to be a Purple Heart recipient, and I need to verify his service record." "Service records are confidential," Colonel Hayes replied immediately, her tone suggesting she'd had this conversation before. "I can't release personnel information to civilian businesses over the phone." Sullivan's face lit up with desperate hope. "So you can't confirm whether someone actually earned a Purple Heart?" "I didn't say that," the colonel replied with the patience of someone dealing with a particularly slow child. "I said I can't release confidential information. However, if the service member in question is present and willing to provide his consent and identification, I can confirm basic service information, including awards and decorations." Marcus stepped closer to the phone, speaking clearly into the handset. "Colonel Hayes, this is Marcus Thompson, formerly Specialist Thompson, 3rd Infantry Division, 2nd Battalion, Alpha Company, service number 123456789. I'm giving my consent for you to confirm my Purple Heart Award to these people." There was a brief pause, followed by the sound of computer keys clicking rapidly. "Specialist Thompson," Colonel Hayes said, her voice warming considerably. "It's good to hear from you. How are you doing?" "I've been better, ma'am," Marcus replied, glancing meaningfully at Sullivan's increasingly pale face. "These folks seem to think my Purple Heart is fake, and my citation is fabricated. I'd appreciate it if you could set the record straight." "Your Purple Heart is absolutely genuine," Colonel Hayes said without hesitation, her voice carrying clearly through the shop's sound system. "Awarded for exceptionally valorous conduct on November 15, 2011, near Kandahar Province, Afghanistan. You were wounded twice during a convoy attack and still managed to evacuate 2 critically injured soldiers under fire. Your actions directly saved the lives of Private First Class David Rodriguez and Sergeant Michael Chen." The shop was so quiet that the sound of Sullivan's labored breathing was clearly audible. Kyle had gone completely white, and Martinez was actively trying to blend into the background near the tool display. Colonel Hayes continued, seemingly unaware of the drama her words were causing. "Specialist Thompson, your service record shows 3 tours in Afghanistan, multiple commendations for valor, and a medical discharge due to combat injuries. Anyone questioning the authenticity of your Purple Heart is either grossly misinformed or deliberately attempting to dishonor your service." "Thank you, Colonel," Marcus said, his voice thick with emotion. "I appreciate you taking the time to confirm this." "It's the least I can do," she replied warmly. "And Specialist Thompson, if anyone gives you trouble about your service record again, you have them call me directly. I'll be happy to educate them about the sacrifices our veterans have made." The line went dead, leaving the shop in absolute silence. Sullivan stood frozen with the phone still pressed to his ear, his face now the color of old concrete. Kyle was staring at the Purple Heart case as if it had suddenly burst into flames, and Martinez had abandoned all pretense of shopping and was edging toward the door. Kowalski was the first to break the silence, his voice filled with righteous anger. "Well, boys, I think you owe this man an apology. And not just any apology, but the kind that comes from deep in your gut where you keep your shame." Sullivan slowly replaced the phone in its cradle, his movements mechanical and uncertain. He began, then stopped, his voice failing him completely. He tried again, his words coming out in a barely audible whisper. "I'm sorry." "What was that?" Marcus asked, cupping his ear theatrically. "I don't think I heard you clearly." "I'm sorry," Sullivan repeated, louder this time, his voice carrying the weight of complete humiliation. "I was wrong about your medal, and your service, and everything else." Kyle shuffled forward reluctantly, his earlier cockiness completely gone. "Yeah, me too. I'm sorry. I didn't know." "You didn't know because you didn't ask," Marcus replied, his voice hard but not unkind. "You saw what you expected to see, instead of what was actually in front of you. You judged me based on my appearance, my clothes, my desperation to sell something precious to me. You never once considered that there might be a real story behind that medal." Lisa Chen stepped forward, her voice gentle but firm. "If you don't mind me asking, why are you selling it? A Purple Heart isn't something you just give up lightly." Marcus's shoulders sagged slightly, the weight of his situation settling over him like a heavy blanket. "My daughter Sarah needs surgery. Experimental treatment for a rare condition that insurance won't cover. The bills are already more than I make in 2 years, and she's only getting worse." He looked down at the Purple Heart case, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. "Tommy Jackson, the friend I lost that day, he used to say that medals were just metal and ribbon. What mattered was the lives we saved and the people we protected. Sarah's my people now. She's all I have left." The raw honesty in his voice seemed to affect everyone in the shop differently. Lisa Chen's eyes welled up with tears, her medical background making her acutely aware of the impossible choices that families faced when dealing with serious illness. Kowalski nodded with understanding, recognizing the sacrifice of a father who would give up anything for his child. Even Kyle seemed moved, his youth making him more susceptible to the emotional weight of the moment. Sullivan, however, appeared to be going through some kind of internal transformation. His face cycled through several expressions: shame, guilt, calculation, and finally something that might have been conscience. He stared at the Purple Heart for a long moment, then looked up at Marcus with an expression that was difficult to read. "Mr. Thompson," Sullivan said slowly, his voice still shaky but gaining strength, "I think we need to talk about this sale." Marcus tensed, preparing for another insult or lowball offer. "What about it?" Sullivan picked up the Purple Heart case and held it carefully, his earlier carelessness replaced by something approaching reverence. "I can't buy this from you. I won't be responsible for separating a war hero from his medal because of medical bills." He set the case back down and looked Marcus directly in the eye. "But I know people who collect military memorabilia. Real collectors who understand the value of authentic pieces and the stories behind them." Kowalski raised an eyebrow, clearly skeptical of Sullivan's sudden change of heart. "What kind of collectors?" "The kind who would pay fair market value for a genuine Purple Heart with full documentation," Sullivan replied, reaching under the counter for a business card file. "There's a collector in Scottsdale who specializes in modern military awards. He's legitimate, licensed, and he pays top dollar for authentic pieces." He pulled out a card and set it on the counter. "Robert Mitchell, Military Heritage Acquisitions. He's dealt with families in situations like yours before." Marcus picked up the business card, studying it carefully. "What kind of money are we talking about?" Sullivan consulted a reference book from behind the counter, flipping through pages of military award valuations. "A genuine Purple Heart with citation and provenance, especially one with a story like yours, could go for anywhere from $15,000 to $25,000 to the right collector. Maybe more if there's a bidding situation." The number hit Marcus like a physical blow. $25,000 was more than he'd hoped to raise by selling everything he owned. It was enough to cover Sarah's initial treatment costs and give them a fighting chance at beating her condition. "Why are you helping me?" Marcus asked, suspicion evident in his voice. "5 minutes ago you were calling me a fraud." Sullivan's face reddened with shame. "Because 5 minutes ago I was an ignorant fool who let prejudice cloud his judgment. Because you served your country with honor while I was here in my shop, passing judgment on people I didn't understand. Because my own father was a veteran, and if someone had treated him the way I treated you today, I would have torn this place apart with my bare hands." The admission seemed to cost Sullivan something, his tough pawnshop owner facade cracking to reveal something more human underneath. Kyle watched his boss with amazement, clearly seeing a side of the man he'd never witnessed before. Lisa Chen stepped closer to the counter, her voice soft but determined. "Mr. Thompson, what's your daughter's condition? I'm a nurse at Phoenix Children's Hospital. Maybe I can help connect you with some resources." Marcus looked at her with surprise, not expecting kindness from a stranger in a pawn shop. "Spinal muscular atrophy, type 2. She's 14, and the progression is accelerating. There's an experimental gene therapy treatment available, but it costs over $300,000, and insurance considers it investigational." Lisa's expression grew serious as she processed the medical information. "I know that treatment. Dr. Sarah Williams in our neurology department has been working with families to get approval for it. The success rates are incredible, but you're right about the cost." She pulled out her own business card and wrote a phone number on the back. "Call this number tomorrow. Ask for Janet Rodriguez in patient advocacy. Tell her Lisa Chen from the ICU referred you. She's worked miracles with insurance companies before." The kindness of strangers was overwhelming Marcus in a way that enemy fire never had. He'd walked into this shop expecting nothing but a quick transaction, prepared to be taken advantage of by people who saw him as desperate. Instead, he was surrounded by people who were actively trying to help him find solutions to his impossible situation. Kowalski placed a weathered hand on Marcus's shoulder. "Son, you've got a whole community here ready to help you. That's what we do for our own." He looked around the shop at the assembled faces. "And despite what happened here today, you've got allies you didn't know about." Sullivan nodded emphatically, still trying to make amends for his earlier behavior. "Mr. Thompson, I want you to know that whatever happens with the collector, you're welcome back here anytime. And if you ever need anything at all, you just ask. It's the least I can do to try to make up for how I acted today." Marcus felt the weight of the last few hours settling over him like a heavy cloak. The humiliation, the anger, the vindication, and now the unexpected kindness of people who had every reason to write him off as just another desperate customer. It was more emotional whiplash than most people experienced in a lifetime, compressed into a single afternoon in a cluttered pawn shop in downtown Phoenix. "I appreciate all of this," Marcus said, his voice hoarse with emotion, "more than you know. But I need to think about what's best for Sarah. Selling this metal feels like betraying everything I believed in when I earned it." "Maybe," Kowalski said gently, "or maybe it's the most honorable thing you can do with it. Tommy Jackson was right about metals being metal and ribbon. The real metal is what you carry in here." He tapped his chest over his heart. "And what you're willing to sacrifice for the people you love. Your daughter needs you to be her hero now, just like your fellow soldiers needed you to be theirs." The wisdom in the old veteran's words resonated through the shop like a bell, and Marcus found himself nodding slowly. The Purple Heart had always been about sacrifice and service, about putting the welfare of others above personal considerations. In a strange way, selling it to save Sarah's life was the most fitting use he could imagine for it. "All right," Marcus said finally, picking up the collector's business card. "I'll call this Mr. Mitchell tomorrow, but I want to meet him in person, look him in the eye, and make sure he understands what this metal represents before I sell it to him." Sullivan nodded approvingly. "That's smart. Mitchell's a good guy." but you should never sell something this important to someone you haven't met face to face." He paused, then added with obvious sincerity, "And Mr. Thompson, when you do meet with him, you tell him that Dave Sullivan personally vouches for the authenticity of that metal and the character of the man who earned it." The afternoon sun was beginning to cast longer shadows through the dusty windows of Sullivan's Pawn and Gold Exchange when the bell above the door chimed with an urgency that made everyone turn. A man in his 30s, wearing crisp military fatigues with sergeant's stripes, strode into the shop with the purposeful gait of someone on official business. His name tag read Williams, and the look on his face suggested he'd heard enough of the conversation through the open door to understand exactly what was happening inside. Sergeant First Class Tony Williams had been walking past the pawn shop on his way back to the Phoenix Military Entrance Processing Station when he'd heard raised voices and the unmistakable mention of Purple Hearts and stolen valor. As the senior recruiter for the area, he'd dealt with enough cases of both genuine heroes and fraudulent claimants to recognize the difference, and something about the conversation he'd overheard had compelled him to investigate. "Excuse me," Williams said, his voice carrying the authority of active-duty military, "but did someone just say they had a Purple Heart recipient in here who needed verification?" His eyes swept the assembled group, taking in Sullivan's obviously distressed state, Kyle's embarrassed posture, and the dignified bearing of the older veteran with the Vietnam cap. Marcus stepped forward, still holding the collector's business card, but now flanked by his unlikely alliance of supporters. "That would be me, Sergeant. Marcus Thompson, formerly with 3rd Infantry Division. These gentlemen had some questions about the authenticity of my award." Williams approached Marcus with the respect that military personnel automatically afforded to combat veterans, especially those who'd been wounded in action. "Sergeant Williams, Phoenix MEPS Station. It's an honor to meet you, sir." He extended his hand in a firm handshake, then looked around at the others with barely concealed disapproval. "I couldn't help but overhear some of this conversation from outside. Did I understand correctly that your service was being questioned?" Sullivan shifted uncomfortably under the sergeant's stern gaze. "There was a misunderstanding. We get a lot of fake military items in here, and sometimes we're a little too quick to assume the worst. But we've since verified Mr. Thompson's service record with the Pentagon, and everything checks out." "A misunderstanding," Williams repeated, his tone suggesting that he found Sullivan's explanation inadequate. "So you publicly accused a Purple Heart recipient of stolen valor based on what, exactly? His appearance? The fact that he needed money?" The sergeant's words cut through the shop's atmosphere like a blade, and even Kowalski nodded approvingly at the military man's direct approach to the situation. Lisa Chen watched the exchange with fascination, seeing how quickly the dynamics had shifted yet again, with the arrival of someone who understood military culture from the inside. Kyle, who had remained mostly silent since the phone call to the Pentagon, finally found his voice. "We didn't know he was really a veteran. I mean, how were we supposed to know?" Williams turned his attention to the young shop employee, with the kind of withering stare that drill sergeants had perfected over generations. "You could have started by showing basic human respect instead of jumping to conclusions. You could have asked to see his military ID, his VA card, or any of a dozen other forms of identification that every veteran carries. You could have listened to his story with an open mind instead of assuming he was lying." The sergeant walked over to the counter where Marcus's Purple Heart lay in its case, studying it with the trained eye of someone who'd seen many such awards during military ceremonies. "This is a genuine Purple Heart, and anyone with basic military knowledge could tell that from across the room. The ribbon wear, the patina on the bronze, the way it's been carefully maintained, everything about it screams authentic." Marcus felt a surge of gratitude toward this stranger who'd appeared like a guardian angel to defend his honor. "Thank you, Sergeant. It's been a difficult afternoon." Williams looked at Marcus with genuine concern. "Sir, if you don't mind me asking, what brings you to a pawn shop with your Purple Heart? That's not something most veterans would part with lightly." The question hung in the air, and Marcus found himself once again explaining his daughter's medical situation to someone new. But this time, the words came easier, perhaps because he was speaking to someone who understood military sacrifice and the difficult choices that veterans sometimes had to make in civilian life. "My daughter Sarah has spinal muscular atrophy," Marcus explained, his voice steady despite the emotional weight of the subject. "She needs experimental gene therapy that costs more money than I'll ever see in my lifetime. The Purple Heart is the most valuable thing I own, and if selling it can help save her life, then that's what I need to do." Williams listened intently, his expression growing more serious with each detail. When Marcus finished, the sergeant was quiet for a long moment, clearly processing the implications of what he'd heard. "Sir, have you contacted the VA about financial assistance for your daughter's treatment? There are programs available for children of disabled veterans that might cover experimental therapies." The question caught Marcus off guard. "I didn't know the VA provided assistance for family members. I thought their medical coverage was just for the veterans themselves." "There are several programs that people don't know about," Williams replied, pulling out his phone and scrolling through his contacts. "The Children of Women Vietnam Veterans Program, the Civilian Health and Medical Program, and a few others that might apply to your situation. Let me make a call." Lisa Chen stepped forward, her earlier offer of help taking on new urgency. "Sergeant Williams, I'm a nurse at Phoenix Children's Hospital. We work with VA benefits coordinators all the time for cases like this. If there are programs that could help Mr. Thompson's daughter, we need to get the paperwork started immediately." The collaboration between the military recruiter and the civilian nurse created a new energy in the shop, transforming what had begun as a humiliating confrontation into something approaching a rescue mission. Sullivan watched the developments with amazement, clearly struggling to understand how his simple business transaction had evolved into a community effort to help a veteran in need. Williams stepped outside to make his phone calls, his voice carrying back into the shop as he spoke with various VA offices and benefit specialists. Meanwhile, Lisa Chen was writing down contact information and medical terminology on the back of receipt paper, building a comprehensive list of resources that Marcus could access for his daughter's care. Kowalski, who had remained a steady presence throughout the afternoon's drama, approached Marcus with the kind of fatherly concern that older veterans often showed to their younger counterparts. "Son, you're learning something important today about the community that exists around people who've served. We take care of our own, even when we don't know each other's names." "I'm starting to see that," Marcus replied, looking around at the unlikely group of allies that had assembled in the cramped pawn shop. "I came in here expecting to be cheated by a guy who saw me as desperate. Instead, I'm surrounded by people who want to help me find solutions I didn't even know existed." Martinez, who had been trying to blend into the background since the Pentagon phone call, finally stepped forward with obvious reluctance. "Mr. Thompson, I owe you an apology too. I was out of line with the things I said. My brother-in-law really did try to pawn a fake Purple Heart, but that doesn't excuse me, assuming you were doing the same thing." The apology was clearly difficult for Martinez, but Marcus could see that it was genuine. "Apology accepted. We all make assumptions sometimes. The important thing is being willing to admit when we're wrong and learn from it." Kyle nodded enthusiastically, still trying to make amends for his earlier behavior. "Mr. Thompson, if there's anything else we can do to help, just let us know. I feel terrible about the way we treated you when you first came in." Sullivan, who had been growing increasingly agitated as he watched the community effort developing around Marcus, suddenly slammed his hand down on the counter with enough force to make the Purple Heart case jump. "This is insane!" he exclaimed, causing everyone to turn and stare at him. "We're talking about a $300,000 medical treatment, like it's something we can just figure out with a few phone calls and some good intentions." The outburst seemed to surprise even Sullivan himself, and he immediately looked embarrassed by his emotional reaction. But the frustration in his voice was genuine, born from years of watching desperate people come into his shop with problems that money couldn't solve and dreams that reality had crushed. "You're right," Marcus said quietly, his voice cutting through the uncomfortable silence that had followed Sullivan's outburst. $300,000 is an impossible amount of money for someone like me. Even if the VA programs cover part of the cost, even if insurance eventually approves some of the treatment, there's going to be a gap that I can't bridge with my security guard's salary. The admission seemed to deflate some of the optimism that had been building in the shop, bringing everyone back to the harsh reality of medical costs and limited resources. But rather than discouraging the group, Sullivan's outburst seemed to galvanize them into a more determined effort. Williams returned from his phone calls with a mixture of good news and sobering reality. I spoke with 3 different VA offices and a benefits specialist at the Phoenix VA Medical Center. The good news is that there are programs that might help. The challenging news is that the application process is complex and time-sensitive. He consulted notes he'd written on his phone during the calls. The Civilian Health and Medical Program of the Department of Veterans Affairs, known as chimed VA, provides coverage for eligible family members of veterans with service-connected disabilities. Since your injuries resulted in a medical discharge, you might qualify. Marcus felt a flicker of hope, but Williams's expression suggested there were complications. What's the catch? The coverage is comprehensive, but experimental treatments require special approval through a process that can take months. Your daughter might not have that kind of time based on what you've described about her condition's progression. Lisa Chen had been listening intently to Williams's report, and her medical background allowed her to understand the implications immediately. What about compassionate use programs? If this gene therapy has shown success in clinical trials, there might be ways to access it through the pharmaceutical company directly. That's exactly what I was thinking, Williams replied, his respect for the nurse's knowledge evident in his voice. I have contacts at the VA who work specifically with pharmaceutical companies on expanded access programs. It's not a guarantee, but it's another avenue to explore. The conversation was becoming increasingly technical, involving medical terminology and bureaucratic processes that were foreign to most of the people in the shop. But Marcus was absorbing every word, his mind racing, as he tried to understand all the potential options that were being presented to him. Sullivan, who had been listening to the discussion with growing amazement, finally spoke up again. I still think you should talk to Robert Mitchell about the Purple Heart. Even if these other programs work out, you're going to need money for travel, hotel stays, time off work, and all the other costs that come with a sick child. The collector's payment could provide the financial cushion you'll need to navigate the system. The suggestion made practical sense, and Marcus found himself nodding in agreement. You're right. Even in the best-case scenario, there are going to be costs that no program will cover. Sarah and I will need flexibility that I can't afford on my current income. Kowalski had been quietly listening to the various suggestions and proposals, and his experience as both a veteran and someone who'd lived through decades of bureaucratic battles gave him a unique perspective on the situation. Marcus, all of these programs and options are good, but you need to understand that fighting the system is going to be a full-time job for the next several months. You're going to need allies who understand how to work within the bureaucracy. What do you mean? Marcus asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. I mean, you're going to need a veteran service organization to help you navigate the VA benefits system, a patient advocate to help you work with the hospital and insurance companies, and probably a lawyer who specializes in disability benefits to make sure you don't get tangled up in red tape. The list of requirements was daunting, and Marcus felt the weight of the challenge settling over him like a heavy blanket. The Purple Heart, in its case, seemed to represent not just his past sacrifice, but his future hope for his daughter's survival. Williams pulled out another business card from his wallet. This is the contact information for the Disabled American Veterans chapter here in Phoenix. They provide free assistance to veterans navigating VA benefits and can connect you with legal resources if needed. Ask for Janet Morrison. She's the benefits coordinator, and she's helped dozens of families in situations similar to yours. Lisa Chen added her own contact to the growing list of resources. And I'll talk to Dr. Williams about your daughter's case when I go back to work tomorrow. She's been involved in several successful compassionate use applications, and she might have insights about the specific gene therapy you mentioned. The accumulation of support and resources was overwhelming Marcus in the best possible way. What had begun as a desperate attempt to raise money through the sale of his most precious possession had transformed into a comprehensive support network that he'd never imagined existed. "I don't know how to thank all of you," Marcus said, his voice thick with emotion. "When I walked in here this afternoon, I thought I was alone in this fight. Now I feel like I have an entire army backing me up." Sullivan, who had been watching the transformation with a mixture of amazement and shame, stepped forward with obvious determination. "Mr. Thompson, I want to make you an offer, and I want you to hear me out before you respond." Marcus looked at the pawnshop owner with curiosity, wondering what new development was about to unfold in this already remarkable afternoon. "I've been in this business for 20 years, Sullivan continued, his voice taking on a serious tone that commanded attention. "I've seen thousands of people come through that door with their most precious possessions, desperate for money to solve problems that seemed insurmountable. Most of the time, all I could do was give them a fraction of what their items were worth, and watch them walk away with their dignity damaged and their problems unsolved." He paused, looking around at the assembled group, before focusing his attention back on Marcus. "But today, I have a chance to do something different, something that might actually make a difference in someone's life, instead of just profiting from their desperation." The shop had fallen completely silent, everyone waiting to hear what Sullivan was proposing. Even the usual background noise of traffic and air conditioning seemed muted, as if the building itself was holding its breath. "I want to buy your Purple Heart for the full collector's price," Sullivan said, his words coming out in a rush, as if he was afraid he might lose his nerve. $25,000, no negotiations, no conditions. But I don't want to keep it or resell it. I want to hold it in trust until you can buy it back." The offer stunned everyone in the shop, including Kyle, who stared at his boss as if he'd never seen him before. Marcus opened his mouth to respond, but Sullivan held up his hand to indicate he wasn't finished. "Here's how it would work," Sullivan continued, his business experience evident in the way he outlined the proposal. "I give you $25,000 today, and you sign an agreement giving me legal ownership of the metal. But the agreement also includes a buyback clause that lets you repurchase it for the same amount, with no interest, whenever you're able to do so. If you can't buy it back within 5 years, then it becomes mine permanently." The generosity of the offer was staggering, and Marcus found himself struggling to process the implications. Sullivan was essentially offering him an interest-free loan secured by the Purple Heart, with terms that were far more favorable than any bank would ever consider. Kowalski was the first to break the silence, his voice filled with approval and surprise. "That's one hell of an offer, son. More generous than I would have expected from someone who was calling this man a fraud an hour ago." Sullivan's face reddened with embarrassment, but his resolve didn't waver. "Maybe that's exactly why I need to make this offer. I can't take back the things I said or undo the way I treated Mr. Thompson, but I can try to make amends by doing something meaningful." Williams nodded approvingly, recognizing the honor in Sullivan's proposal. "That's the kind of gesture that restores faith in people's capacity for redemption. Mr. Thompson, this could give you the financial flexibility you need while keeping your metal in the family, so to speak." Lisa Chen looked between Marcus and Sullivan with amazement. "This is incredible. In the span of 2 hours, we've gone from a hostile confrontation to a community rescue mission. It's like watching the best of human nature emerge from the worst." Marcus stared at the Purple Heart case, his mind racing through the implications of Sullivan's offer. The money would indeed provide the financial cushion he needed to fight for Sarah's treatment, but more importantly, it would allow him to keep the metal that represented the most significant sacrifice of his life. "Why would you do this?" Marcus asked Sullivan directly. "What's in it for you?" Sullivan was quiet for a long moment, clearly struggling with how to articulate his motivations. "My father served in Korea," he said finally. "He came home with medals and memories that he never talked about, but I could see the weight they carried. He died 10 years ago, and I never really understood what his service meant until today." He looked down at the Purple Heart case, his voice growing softer. "Watching you stand here with dignity while I insulted your service and questioned your sacrifice, it made me realize that I've been treating veteran stories like just another commodity to be bought and sold. But they're not commodities. They're sacred trusts." The admission seemed to cost Sullivan something, his tough businessman exterior cracking to reveal genuine emotion underneath. "I can't give your father the respect he deserved, Mr. Thompson, but I can try to give you the respect you've earned. This offer isn't charity. It's restitution." The word hung in the air like incense, heavy with meaning and implication. Marcus understood that Sullivan's offer represented more than just a financial transaction. It was an acknowledgement of wrongs committed and an attempt to restore honor where honor had been denied. "I need to think about this," Marcus said, though his heart was already leaning toward acceptance. "This is my daughter's future we're talking about, and I can't make decisions based on emotion alone." "Of course," Sullivan replied immediately. "Take all the time you need. The offer stands regardless of how long you need to consider it." Kyle, who had been watching the entire exchange with growing amazement, finally spoke up. "Boss, I've never seen you do anything like this before. Are you sure about this?" Sullivan looked at his employee with a mixture of sadness and determination. "Kyle, I've been in this business long enough to know that some things are more valuable than money. Today I learned that a man's honor is one of those things. Mr. Thompson's Purple Heart isn't just a piece of metal and ribbon. It's a symbol of sacrifice that deserves to be treated with reverence, not skepticism." The transformation in Sullivan's attitude was remarkable, and everyone in the shop could see that the confrontation with Marcus had fundamentally changed the pawnshop owner's perspective on his business and his responsibilities to the veterans who sought his services. Martinez, who had remained largely silent since his earlier apology, stepped forward with obvious hesitation. "Mr. Thompson, I know I don't have the right to ask anything of you after the way I acted, but if there's anything I can do to help with your daughter's situation, I'd like to be involved." The offer surprised Marcus, coming from someone who had been actively hostile just hours earlier. "What did you have in mind?" "I work in construction, and I know a lot of guys in the trades," Martinez replied, his voice gaining confidence as he spoke. "If you need help with fundraising, organizing events, or just spreading the word about your daughter's situation, we could probably mobilize some resources. Construction workers are good at that kind of thing." The continuing expansion of support was overwhelming Marcus in ways he hadn't expected. What had begun as a solitary struggle to save his daughter was becoming a community effort involving people from all walks of life, united by a shared recognition of his service and sacrifice. Williams checked his watch and realized that his unofficial lunch break had stretched far longer than intended. "Mr. Thompson, I need to get back to the office, but I want you to have my direct contact information. Call me tomorrow morning, and I'll help you get connected with all the VA resources we discussed." As the sergeant prepared to leave, he paused at the door and addressed the entire group. "What I've witnessed here today gives me hope for our country. When people put aside their prejudices and come together to help a veteran in need, it reminds me why I chose to serve in the first place." The door chimed as Williams left, but his words continued to resonate through the shop. The afternoon sun was beginning to slant through the windows at a sharper angle, reminding everyone that time was passing and that decisions would need to be made soon. Marcus looked around at the faces surrounding him, each one representing a different kind of support and assistance. Sullivan with his generous offer, Lisa Chen with her medical connections, Kowalski with his veteran's wisdom, even Kyle and Martinez with their newfound respect and desire to help. The Purple Heart case sat in the center of it all, no longer just a symbol of past sacrifice, but a catalyst for present generosity. "I'll take your offer," Marcus said to Sullivan, his voice clear and decisive, "but I want to make one modification to the terms." Sullivan raised an eyebrow, clearly curious about what change Marcus had in mind. "What kind of modification?" "I want the agreement to include a provision that if anything happens to me before I can buy back the metal, it goes to Sarah. It should be her decision whether to keep it or sell it, not yours." The request made perfect sense. and Sullivan nodded immediately. Of course, that's completely reasonable. We'll have the paperwork drawn up to include that provision. As the details of the agreement were being discussed, Lisa Chen realized that she needed to return to the hospital for her next shift. Mr. Thompson, I'll call you tomorrow after I've spoken with Dr. Williams about your daughter's case. And don't forget to contact Janet Rodriguez about the insurance advocacy services. The nurse's departure marked the beginning of the group's gradual dispersal, but not before each person had committed to specific actions that would help Marcus navigate the complex challenges ahead. Kowalski provided his contact information and promised to connect Marcus with the local DAV chapter. Martinez exchanged phone numbers and began discussing potential fundraising ideas. Even Kyle offered to help with research, using his computer skills to find additional resources and programs that might be relevant to Sarah's situation. As the shop returned to something approaching normal, with only Marcus, Sullivan, and Kyle remaining, the weight of the afternoon's events began to settle over all of them. The transformation that had occurred was remarkable, not just in terms of the practical assistance that had been mobilized, but in the fundamental shift in understanding and respect that had taken place. Sullivan looked at the Purple Heart case one more time before carefully closing it and handing it back to Marcus. This stays with you until we complete the paperwork. A medal like this shouldn't spend even one night away from the man who earned it. The gesture was small but significant, another indication of how completely Sullivan's attitude had changed over the course of the afternoon. Marcus accepted the case with gratitude, understanding that he was not just receiving a loan agreement, but a restoration of the dignity that had been challenged when he first walked through the shop's doors. "Thank you," Marcus said, the words carrying weight far beyond their simple syllables. "All of you. When I woke up this morning, I felt like I was carrying the weight of Sarah's illness alone. Now I feel like I have a whole community standing with me." Kyle, who had been unusually quiet during the final negotiations, finally spoke up. "Mr. Thompson, can I ask you something?" "Sure," Marcus replied, curious about what the young man wanted to know. "How do you stay so calm when people are questioning your honor? I mean, if someone accused me of lying about something that important, I think I would have lost my temper." Marcus considered the question carefully, recognizing it as an opportunity to share something meaningful with someone who was clearly struggling to understand the afternoon's events. Military training teaches you that anger is a luxury you can't afford when lives are on the line. When people were shooting at me in Afghanistan, getting angry wouldn't have helped my soldiers get home safely. When people question my service here at home, getting angry won't help my daughter get the treatment she needs. He paused, looking at Kyle with the kind of paternal concern that suggested he saw potential in the young man that perhaps Kyle didn't see in himself. The trick is to remember that their ignorance isn't about you, it's about them. People make assumptions because they don't know better, not because they're evil. Most of the time, if you give them a chance to learn, they'll surprise you with their capacity for growth. Kyle nodded thoughtfully, clearly processing the wisdom in Marcus's words. "I'll remember that. And Mr. Thompson, I promise that if any other veterans come in here needing help, they'll be treated with the respect they deserve." The commitment was exactly what Marcus had hoped to hear, suggesting that the afternoon's lessons would have lasting impact beyond just his immediate situation. As he prepared to leave the shop, Marcus felt a sense of accomplishment that had nothing to do with the financial arrangement he'd negotiated with Sullivan. He had walked into Sullivan's pawn and gold exchange as a desperate father trying to sell his most precious possession. He was leaving as a man whose honor had been challenged, defended, and ultimately restored, surrounded by a network of support that he'd never imagined existed. The Purple Heart remained in his possession, at least for now, but more importantly, the values it represented had been validated and strengthened through the crucible of confrontation and redemption. The bell above the door chimed one final time as Marcus stepped out into the late afternoon sun, carrying with him not just the promise of financial assistance for his daughter's treatment, but the renewed faith in human nature that would sustain him through the challenges ahead. 3 months had passed since that transformative afternoon at Sullivan's Pawn and Gold Exchange, and the October morning brought with it the crisp promise of change that only autumn in Arizona could deliver. Marcus Thompson stood in the hallway outside the gene therapy treatment room at Phoenix Children's Hospital, watching through the observation window as his daughter Sarah received what would hopefully be her final infusion of the revolutionary treatment that had seemed impossible to afford just a few short months ago. The journey from that desperate visit to the pawn shop to this moment of hope had been nothing short of miraculous, involving a coordination of resources and support that Marcus still found difficult to believe. The community that had spontaneously formed around him in Sullivan's shop had not only maintained their commitments, but had expanded their efforts in ways that exceeded even the most optimistic expectations. Dr. Sarah Williams emerged from the treatment room, pulling off her surgical mask with the satisfied expression of someone who had just completed a complex procedure with successful results. She approached Marcus with the kind of warm professionalism that had made her one of the most respected pediatric neurologists in the Southwest, her eyes reflecting the cautious optimism that had sustained both her and Marcus's family through the challenging treatment protocol. "The infusion went perfectly," Dr. Williams said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had overseen hundreds of similar procedures. "Sarah's response to the gene therapy has been better than we dared hope when we started this process. Her muscle function tests are showing improvement that we typically don't see until much later in the treatment cycle." Marcus felt the familiar surge of relief and gratitude that had become his constant companion over the past several weeks. Each positive report from Dr. Williams represented not just medical progress, but vindication of the faith that so many people had placed in Sarah's recovery and his own worthiness as both a father and a veteran. "What happens next?" Marcus asked, though he already knew the answer from their previous conversations. The question had become a ritual between them, a way of marking progress and maintaining hope through the uncertainty of experimental treatment. "We continue monitoring her response for the next 6 months," Dr. Williams replied, consulting the tablet that contained Sarah's comprehensive treatment records. "The gene therapy works by essentially reprogramming her cells to produce the proteins that her condition prevents her body from making naturally. If the treatment is successful, we should see continued improvement in her muscle strength and motor function over the coming year." Through the observation window, Marcus could see Sarah sitting up in the treatment chair, laughing at something one of the nurses had said. The transformation in her physical condition over the past 3 months had been remarkable, but even more striking was the return of the vibrant spirit that had made her such a joy to be around before her condition had begun to deteriorate. Lisa Chen appeared at Marcus's elbow, having just finished her shift in the hospital's intensive care unit. The nurse who had offered her help in the pawn shop that day had become not just an advocate for Sarah's care, but a genuine friend to the entire Thompson family, providing guidance and support that had proven invaluable in navigating the complex medical system. "How did today's session go?" Lisa asked, though she could already read the answer in Marcus's relaxed posture and genuine smile. The transformation in his demeanor over the past 3 months had been almost as dramatic as his daughter's medical improvement, as the constant weight of desperation and fear had been gradually replaced by hope and community support. "Better than expected," Marcus replied, turning to include Lisa in his conversation with Dr. Williams. "Dr. Williams says Sarah's response is ahead of schedule, and we might be looking at even better outcomes than the clinical trial suggested." Lisa's face lit up with the kind of professional satisfaction that came from seeing a difficult case reach a successful conclusion. "That's wonderful news. I know how hard you've both worked to get to this point." She paused, glancing through the window at Sarah, who was now engaged in animated conversation with her treatment team. "Speaking of hard work, have you heard from Sergeant Williams about the VA benefits approval?" The mention of the military recruiter who had appeared like a guardian angel in the pawn shop brought Marcus's attention back to the broader network of support that had made Sarah's treatment possible. Sergeant Tony Williams had proven to be remarkably effective at navigating the VA bureaucracy, securing benefits and services that Marcus had never known existed. "The final approval came through yesterday," Marcus said, pulling out his phone to show Lisa the email confirmation that had arrived from the Department of Veterans Affairs. "Full coverage for Sarah's treatment under the expanded chimed VA benefits, retroactive to the beginning of her therapy. It means we'll be reimbursed for most of the costs we've already paid. Dr. Williams looked up from her tablet with interest. That's excellent news. The financial stress of experimental treatments can be almost as debilitating for families as the medical conditions themselves. Having that burden lifted will allow you to focus entirely on Sarah's recovery and rehabilitation. The approval of VA benefits had been a long and complex process, involving multiple appeals and the intervention of several veteran service organizations that Walter Kowalski had connected Marcus with through his extensive network of fellow veterans. The elderly Vietnam veteran had proven to be remarkably well connected within the veterans community, and his personal endorsement of Marcus's case had opened doors that might otherwise have remained closed. "Mr. Thompson?" A familiar voice called from down the hallway, and Marcus turned to see Sullivan approaching with a large bouquet of flowers and an expression of nervous anticipation. The pawn shop owner had made it a point to visit Sarah during each of her treatment sessions, bringing gifts and updates on the various fundraising efforts that had continued even after the VA benefits had been secured. Sullivan's transformation over the past 3 months had been perhaps the most remarkable of all the changes that had resulted from that confrontational afternoon in his shop. The man who had once questioned Marcus's honor and authenticity had become one of Sarah's most devoted champions, organizing fundraising events and using his business connections to generate support for other veteran families facing similar challenges. "How's our girl doing today?" Sullivan asked, setting the flowers on a nearby table and peering through the observation window with the protective concern of an honorary grandfather. The relationship that had developed between Sullivan and the Thompson family had surprised everyone, including Sullivan himself, who had discovered a capacity for genuine generosity that had been buried beneath years of cynical business practices. "She's doing great," Marcus replied, genuinely pleased to see the man who had become such an unexpected ally. "Dr. Williams says her progress is ahead of schedule, and the VA benefits approval means we're finally on solid financial ground." Sullivan's face broke into a wide grin, the kind of expression that completely transformed his appearance and reminded everyone present of the fundamental goodness that had emerged from their initial conflict. "That's the best news I've heard all week. Kyle's going to be thrilled when I tell him. He's been tracking Sarah's progress like a medical student." The mention of Kyle brought a smile to Marcus's face as he remembered the young shop employee who had been so hostile during their first encounter, but had since become one of Sarah's most enthusiastic supporters. Kyle had used his computer skills to research experimental treatments, and had even created a website to help other veteran families find resources for their own medical challenges. "Actually," Sullivan continued, reaching into his jacket pocket, "I have something for you." He pulled out a manila envelope that was sealed and marked with official-looking stamps. "This came to the shop yesterday, addressed to you care of Sullivan's Pawn and Gold Exchange." Marcus accepted the envelope with curiosity, noting the return address that identified it as coming from the Department of Defense. Inside, he found an official letter on Pentagon letterhead, signed by Colonel Patricia Hayes, the same officer who had verified his service record during that memorable phone call 3 months earlier. The letter was formal and congratulatory, acknowledging Marcus's service and sacrifice while also recognizing the exemplary character he had demonstrated in his civilian life as a devoted father and community member. But the final paragraph contained information that made Marcus's hands tremble as he read it aloud for the benefit of the assembled group. "The Department of Defense is pleased to inform you that your actions in advocating for veteran families and raising awareness of the challenges faced by military children with medical needs have come to the attention of senior leadership. Effective immediately, you are being offered a position as a family readiness liaison with the Phoenix VA Medical Center, with responsibilities including outreach to veteran families, coordination of benefits services, and advocacy for military children requiring specialized medical care." The job offer was unexpected and overwhelming, representing not just employment but a calling that would allow Marcus to use his own experience to help other families navigate the complex challenges that he had just successfully overcome. The salary mentioned in the letter was more than double what he had been making as a security guard, and the benefits package included comprehensive medical coverage for both him and Sarah. Dr. Williams was the first to break the stunned silence that had followed Marcus's reading of the letter. "That's incredible news. The VA has been looking for someone with real-world experience to help families understand the benefit system. Your personal knowledge of what works and what doesn't would be invaluable in that role." Lisa Chen nodded enthusiastically, her professional experience giving her insight into how desperately such a position was needed. "I see families struggling with VA bureaucracy all the time. Having someone who's been through the process and knows how to make the system work could literally save lives." Sullivan was beaming with pride as if he had somehow been responsible for the job offer, though everyone knew that Marcus's own actions and character had earned the recognition from the Pentagon. "This is perfect. You'll be able to help other families avoid the kind of desperation that brought you to my shop in the first place." The irony of the situation was not lost on Marcus, who remembered the humiliation and anger he had felt when Sullivan had questioned his service record. Now, that same service record was opening doors to opportunities he had never imagined possible, and the man who had initially doubted his authenticity had become one of his strongest supporters. "I need to think about this," Marcus said, though his heart was already leaning toward acceptance. "It would mean a complete career change, and I'd be responsible for helping families in situations that I know can be overwhelming." "Which is exactly why you're the right person for the job," came a familiar voice from behind them. Marcus turned to see Walter Kowalski approaching with his characteristic determined stride, despite his advanced age and reliance on a walking cane. The elderly Vietnam veteran had maintained regular contact with Marcus throughout Sarah's treatment, providing guidance and encouragement that had proven invaluable during the most challenging moments. "Walter," Marcus said warmly, "what brings you to the hospital today?" Kowalski smiled with the satisfaction of someone who had been planning a surprise. "I heard through the veteran grapevine that today was Sarah's final treatment session, and I wanted to be here to celebrate with you. Plus, I have some news that I think you'll find interesting." The elderly veteran reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a newspaper clipping from the Phoenix Veterans Tribune, a local publication that served the military community throughout Arizona. The headline read, "Local Pawn Shop Owner Honors Purple Heart Recipient," and the accompanying photo showed Sullivan presenting a check to Marcus in front of the pawn shop, with Kyle and several other community members looking on. "The story's been picked up by veterans organizations across the country," Kowalski explained, his voice filled with pride. "It's being used as an example of how civilian businesses can better serve military families and how communities can come together to support veterans in need." Marcus read through the article, which accurately captured the events of that transformative afternoon, while also highlighting the ongoing support that had made Sarah's treatment possible. The reporter had interviewed everyone involved, from Sullivan and Kyle to Lisa Chen and Sergeant Williams, creating a comprehensive picture of how one confrontation had sparked a community-wide effort to help a veteran family in crisis. "There's more," Kowalski continued, pulling out another document. "The American Legion, veterans of foreign wars, and disabled American veterans have all reached out about using your story as part of their outreach programs. They want to train their members on how to identify and assist families dealing with medical crises." The scope of the impact was overwhelming, suggesting that the events that had begun in Sullivan's pawn and gold exchange were having ripple effects throughout the veterans community. Marcus found himself thinking about Tommy Jackson and the other soldiers he had served with, wondering if they would be proud of how their sacrifice was continuing to inspire service to others. Dr. Williams checked her watch and realized that she needed to prepare for her next patient, but before leaving, she turned to address Marcus directly. "Whatever you decide about the VA position, I want you to know that watching Sarah's recovery has been one of the most rewarding experiences of my medical career. Not just because of the treatment success, but because of the way your family has handled this challenge with such grace and determination." As the doctor departed, Sarah finally emerged from the treatment room, walking with the improved stability that had been one of the most visible signs of her progress. She approached the group with the kind of confidence that had been missing during the worst days of her condition, and Marcus felt his heart swell with pride at the sight of his daughter's renewed vitality. "Dad," Sarah said, noticing the official letter in his hands, "what's that? You look like you've seen a ghost." Marcus handed her the letter, watching as she read through the job offer with the kind of careful attention that reminded him of her mother. Sarah had inherited her analytical mind and practical nature, qualities that had helped her cope with her medical condition with remarkable maturity for someone her age. "This is amazing," Sarah said after finishing the letter. "You'd be helping other families like us, wouldn't you? Families who don't know how to navigate all the programs and benefits that are available?" The question went straight to the heart of why the position appealed to Marcus so strongly. His own experience had taught him that the resources existed to help veteran families facing medical crises, but that the system was so complex and intimidating that many people gave up before finding the assistance they needed. "That's exactly what the job would involve," Marcus replied. "But it would also mean working at the VA full-time, dealing with bureaucracy every day, and probably bringing home a lot of other families' stress and worry." Sarah looked at him with the kind of direct honesty that teenagers were uniquely capable of delivering. "Dad, you've been carrying other people's stress and worry your whole life. In the Army, you worried about your soldiers. Since Mom died, you've been worrying about me. At least now you'd be getting paid to help people, instead of just carrying their burdens for free." The wisdom in his daughter's words hit Marcus like a revelation, making him realize that the VA position wasn't just a job opportunity, but a chance to transform his natural inclination to serve others into something that could benefit entire communities of veteran families. Sullivan, who had been listening to the conversation with growing enthusiasm, stepped forward with characteristic directness. "Marcus, you have to take this job. Not just because it's a great opportunity for you and Sarah, but because there are hundreds of families out there right now who need someone like you to help them navigate the system." Lisa Chen nodded in agreement, her experience as a nurse giving her perspective on the daily struggles that families faced when dealing with complex medical and insurance issues. "I see the frustration and desperation that parents go through when they're trying to get help for their children. Having someone at the VA who's actually been through the process would make such a difference." Kowalski approached Marcus with the kind of paternal authority that came from decades of mentoring younger veterans. "Son, you've spent your whole adult life serving others. In the military, you served your country and your fellow soldiers. As a father, you've served your daughter with devotion that would make any parent proud. Now you have a chance to serve your community in a way that could help thousands of families avoid the kind of desperation that brought you to that pawn shop." The accumulation of perspectives and encouragement was having its intended effect, and Marcus found himself nodding slowly as he considered the implications of accepting the VA position. The job would provide financial security for his family while also allowing him to use his experiences to help others, creating a sense of purpose that had been missing from his work as a security guard. "There's one more thing," Sullivan said, reaching into his other jacket pocket. "I've been holding on to this for the right moment." He pulled out the familiar velvet case that contained Marcus's Purple Heart, the medal that had sparked their initial confrontation and had since become a symbol of redemption and community support. Marcus stared at the case in surprise, having assumed that it would remain in Sullivan's possession until he could afford to buy it back, according to their agreement. "What's this about?" Sullivan opened the case to reveal the Purple Heart resting in its original position, the bronze medal gleaming under the hospital's fluorescent lights. The fundraising efforts that Kyle organized, combined with donations from the veteran organizations that Walter connected us with, raised enough money to buy back your medal. It belongs with you and Sarah, not sitting in my safe. The gesture was overwhelming in its generosity and symbolism, representing not just the return of a precious possession, but the completion of a cycle that had begun with conflict and was ending with community triumph. Marcus accepted the case with hands that trembled slightly, understanding that he was receiving far more than just a military decoration. Kyle appeared at the end of the hallway, having arrived directly from the pawn shop with his characteristic enthusiasm for dramatic timing. "Did he give it to you yet?" Kyle called out as he approached the group. "I've been waiting all week for this moment." The young man's excitement was infectious, and Marcus found himself smiling at the transformation that Kyle had undergone since their first hostile encounter. The shop employee who had once mocked his service had become one of his most dedicated advocates, using his energy and computer skills to coordinate support efforts that had exceeded everyone's expectations. Kyle organized most of the fundraising, Sullivan explained with obvious pride in his employees' efforts. He created a website, coordinated with veteran organizations, and even got local businesses to contribute. The kid's got a real talent for community organizing. Kyle blushed at the praise but couldn't hide his satisfaction at the successful completion of the project. I figured it was the least I could do after the way I acted when you first came in. Plus, working on this project taught me more about veterans and military service than I ever learned in school. Sarah stepped forward to examine the Purple Heart more closely, running her fingers gently over the bronze surface that had become such an important symbol in her family's story. Dad, this medal represents the day you saved those soldiers in Afghanistan, right? Marcus nodded, his voice thick with emotion as he considered how to explain the complex feelings that the medal represented. It represents one of the worst days of my military service, but also one of the most important. It's a reminder that sometimes we have to make sacrifices to protect the people we care about. Like selling it to pay for my treatment, Sarah said, with the kind of insight that demonstrated her understanding of the difficult choices her father had been prepared to make for her sake. Exactly like that, Marcus replied. But now we've learned that when good people come together, sometimes nobody has to make those kinds of sacrifices alone. Kowalski stepped forward with the formal bearing that suggested he had something important to say. Marcus, on behalf of the veteran community that has rallied around your family, I want to present you with something. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a framed certificate from the Disabled American Veterans Organization, recognizing Marcus for his advocacy work and community service. The DAV chapter has voted to make you an honorary lifetime member, Kowalski announced, in recognition of your service to fellow veterans and their families. The certificate includes access to all DAV resources and programs, and more importantly, it represents the respect and gratitude of your fellow veterans. The honor was unexpected and deeply meaningful, representing acceptance and recognition from the veteran community that had become such an important source of support and identity for Marcus. As he accepted the certificate, he felt the weight of responsibility that came with the recognition, understanding that his actions had made him a representative of veteran families facing similar challenges. Sullivan checked his watch and realized that he needed to return to the shop, but before leaving he turned to address the entire group. I want all of you to know that what we've accomplished here over the past 3 months has changed my life in ways I never expected. My business has always been about buying and selling things, but now I understand that some things are too valuable to be reduced to mere transactions. He looked directly at Marcus, his voice taking on the weight of genuine emotion. Your Purple Heart taught me that honor and sacrifice can't be bought or sold, only recognized and respected. Thank you for giving me the chance to learn that lesson, even though I didn't deserve your patience with my ignorance. As Sullivan departed, followed shortly by Kyle, who was eager to share the day's developments with the regular customers who had been following Sarah's progress, the group in the hospital hallway had dwindled to just Marcus, Sarah, Lisa Chen, and Walter Kowalski. The late afternoon sun was streaming through the windows, casting long shadows that seemed to mark the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. Dr. Williams returned with Sarah's discharge paperwork and final treatment instructions, her professional demeanor softened by the obvious emotional significance of the moment. Sarah, you've been an exemplary patient throughout this entire process. Your positive attitude and determination have been an inspiration to our entire treatment team. She turned to Marcus with the kind of respect that medical professionals reserved for parents who had advocated effectively for their children under difficult circumstances. And Mr. Thompson, your dedication to ensuring that Sarah received the best possible care, despite the financial and logistical challenges, exemplifies everything that's admirable about military service and parental devotion. As the family prepared to leave the hospital, Marcus reflected on the incredible journey that had brought them to this moment of hope and possibility. The desperate father who had walked into Sullivan's pawn and gold exchange 3 months earlier, prepared to sell his most precious possession to save his daughter's life, had been transformed into a community advocate, with the resources and support network necessary to help other families facing similar challenges. The Purple Heart that had nearly been sold in desperation was now safely back in his possession, its significance enhanced rather than diminished by the ordeal they had endured. Sarah's health was improving beyond their most optimistic expectations, and the VA position offered the opportunity to transform their personal struggle into a platform for helping others. "Dad," Sarah said as they walked toward the hospital exit, "are you going to take the VA job?" Marcus looked down at his daughter, seeing in her face the strength and determination that had carried her through months of challenging treatment. "Yes, I think I am. But only if you're okay with having a father who brings work stress home every night." Sarah laughed, the sound echoing through the hospital corridor like music. "I think I can handle it. Besides, after everything we've been through, a little work stress sounds pretty manageable." As they stepped out into the crisp October evening, Marcus felt the weight of the Purple Heart case in his jacket pocket, no longer a burden of desperation but a symbol of hope and community support. The medal that had once represented the worst day of his military service had become the catalyst for one of the most transformative experiences of his civilian life. 6 months later, Marcus Thompson sat in his office at the Phoenix VA Medical Center, reviewing the case file of a veteran family whose daughter needed experimental treatment for a rare genetic condition. The parallels to his own situation were striking, but now he had the knowledge, resources, and network of support necessary to help them navigate the complex system that had once seemed so overwhelming. His desk was covered with thank-you letters from families he had helped, updates from Sarah's medical team confirming her continued progress, and invitations to speak at veteran organization meetings about the importance of community support for military families facing medical crises. The Purple Heart sat in a place of honor on his bookshelf, no longer hidden away but displayed as a reminder of the values that had guided his military service and continued to inspire his civilian work. Next to it was a photograph of Sarah at her high school graduation, her improved health allowing her to participate in activities that had seemed impossible just 2 years earlier. A knock on his office door interrupted his reflection, and Marcus looked up to see Sullivan entering with his characteristic combination of nervousness and determination. The pawnshop owner had become a regular visitor to the VA center, volunteering his time to help with fundraising events and using his business connections to generate support for veteran families. "How's the new case looking?" Sullivan asked, settling into the chair across from Marcus's desk with the familiarity of someone who had become both friend and collaborator in their ongoing efforts to help military families. "Challenging, but not hopeless," Marcus replied, closing the case file and leaning back in his chair. "The family is dealing with some of the same insurance and benefits issues that we faced, but now we know how to work the system effectively." Sullivan nodded with satisfaction, understanding that each successful case they handled together was a small victory against the bureaucratic obstacles that prevented veteran families from accessing the resources they needed. "Kyle wanted me to tell you that the website he created has received over 50,000 visits this month. Families from all over the country are using the resource guides and contact lists that you've developed." The impact of their collaborative efforts continued to exceed Marcus's expectations, demonstrating that the community support that had formed around his family's crisis had the potential to help thousands of other veterans facing similar challenges. The Purple Heart that had once represented personal sacrifice had become a symbol of collective service to the military community. "There's something else," Sullivan continued, reaching into his jacket pocket with the kind of theatrical flair that had become his signature when delivering good news. "I got a call from the American Legion National Headquarters. They want to present you with their Distinguished Service Award at their convention next month." The recognition was gratifying but secondary to the satisfaction that Marcus derived from his daily work helping families navigate the complex systems that could mean the difference between hope and desperation. Each successful case was a reminder that the lessons learned from his own struggle could be transformed into tools for serving others. As Sullivan prepared to leave, he paused at the office door with the kind of reflective expression that suggested he was still processing the transformative events that had brought them together. "Marcus, I've been thinking about that afternoon in my shop, about how close I came to making one of the biggest mistakes of my life." Marcus looked up from his paperwork, understanding that Sullivan was referring to more than just their initial confrontation. "What do you mean?" I almost let my prejudices and assumptions prevent me from recognizing a genuine hero who needed help, Sullivan replied, his voice carrying the weight of genuine regret. If you hadn't been patient enough to let me learn from my mistakes, if you hadn't given me the chance to make amends, I would have missed the opportunity to be part of something really meaningful. The admission was characteristic of the humility that Sullivan had developed over the past 2 years, a transformation that Marcus considered one of the most remarkable outcomes of their entire experience. We all make assumptions sometimes. The important thing is being willing to admit when we're wrong and learn from the experience. That's what I'm trying to teach Kyle, Sullivan said, with obvious pride in his protégé's continued growth. He's enrolled in community college now, studying business administration and nonprofit management. Says he wants to start an organization that helps veteran families with medical crises. The news brought a smile to Marcus's face as he considered the young man who had transformed from a hostile skeptic into a passionate advocate for military families. Kyle's evolution represented perhaps the most dramatic personal change that had resulted from their confrontation, demonstrating the power of education and exposure to overcome prejudice and ignorance. As evening settled over Phoenix, Marcus gathered his files and prepared to leave the office, looking forward to dinner with Sarah, who was now thriving in her first year of college. The Purple Heart would accompany him home, as it did every night, a constant reminder of the values that had shaped his military service and continued to guide his civilian mission. The medal that had once nearly been sold in a pawn shop had become the foundation for a new life dedicated to serving others, transforming personal struggle into community service and individual sacrifice into collective support. The honor that had been challenged in a moment of desperation had been restored and multiplied through the generosity of strangers who had become family. Walking through the VA Center's lobby, Marcus paused to read the memorial wall dedicated to veterans who had made the ultimate sacrifice for their country. Among the names was Tommy Jackson, the friend whose memory had sustained Marcus through his darkest moments, and whose values continued to inspire his daily work. The Purple Heart in his jacket pocket seemed to pulse with significance. As Marcus considered how far he had traveled from that desperate afternoon, when he had been prepared to sell his most precious possession to save his daughter's life, the medal had been transformed from a symbol of past sacrifice into a catalyst for present service, demonstrating that true honor could never be diminished by temporary circumstances. Outside, the Arizona sunset painted the sky in shades of purple and gold, reminding Marcus of the colors that adorned his Purple Heart ribbon. Sarah would be waiting at home, with updates on her college courses and plans for the future that her recovered health had made possible. The community that had formed around their crisis continued to thrive, helping other families navigate challenges that no one should have to face alone. The pawn shop where it all began still stood on the same corner in downtown Phoenix, but now it bore a small plaque near the entrance, recognizing it as the birthplace of a movement that had helped hundreds of veteran families access the resources they needed. Sullivan continued to operate his business with a new understanding of the value of things that couldn't be measured in dollars, and Kyle had become a local celebrity in the veteran community for his advocacy work. As Marcus drove home through the familiar streets of Phoenix, he reflected on the lesson that had emerged from their collective experience, that honor, once tested by adversity, could be strengthened rather than diminished by the challenges it faced. The Purple Heart that rode in his pocket had survived an attempted sale, a community rescue, and a transformation into something greater than its original meaning. The medal that had represented one soldier's sacrifice in Afghanistan had become a symbol of an entire community's commitment to supporting those who had served their country with distinction. In saving Sarah's life, Marcus had discovered a calling that would define the rest of his own, proving that the values symbolized by the Purple Heart were not relics of the past, but living principles that could guide present action and inspire future service. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.